We're in Standard 6, looking at the 1920s, Great Depression, and New Deal. Today we're going to look at 6.2, which is about the 1920s and about the social change and conflict in the 1920s. 1920s is a really interesting decade in American history. There's a lot of social change and there's a lot of conflict that takes place in society. So we're going to talk about some of the causes and effects of that social change, as well as like the conflict that happens between traditional and modern culture. We're going to look at the Red Scare, the role of women, the resurgence of the KKK, immigration quotas, prohibition, and then we're going to finish it off with the Scopes trial. So to start off with, the 1920s is really often thought of as a carefree time in American history where their economy was like booming and everything was really, really good. But in reality, American society was divided by the trauma of change, and not everyone experienced prosperity. We already talked about the coal workers and farmers and skilled workers and laborers that really didn't have the same economic prosperity that other people did. There's also a lot of social changes that brought about a lot of anxiety as Americans struggled with changes because of industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. Change was also caused due to an increasing emphasis on science, and the experience of the warriors often led to social conflict between conservatives and liberals, which we're going to talk a lot about in Standard 8, and we've also talked about earlier in American history, and will continue to be a theme. So the role of women. During World War I, women had done their part and they'd gotten a lot of jobs while the men were off fighting, and many of them ended up giving up those jobs when the men returned. After the war, though, women did not win any new opportunities in the workplace. They continued to be concentrated in just a few occupations in which they had made inroads since the Civil War. All had one thing in common. Working men made more than working women. And it says it the opposite way on here, but I changed it around. Here are some of the occupations that women could have had at the time. You can see some of the pictures of it. You have the invention of the typewriter, which allows women to be secretaries, nurses, teachers, all those jobs. Women did get the right to vote in 1920, which is a big deal. They'd been fighting for it since Seneca Falls in 1848. They had pushed for it on one grounds that they were going to make they're making the political scene more moral because women were thought of as the more innocent gender, the more moral gender. But in reality, they voted just the same way as their husbands did, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, to be perfectly honest, my wife probably votes about the same way as I do, and that's because that's one reason why we're married. We're similar. The movement to the cities nurtured a lot of new attitudes towards sex, but caused a lot of anxiety about the decline of moral values. And the flappers were a good example of that. We see that with every generation. Every generation says that about the generation that comes after them, that they're much worse than our generation. Like you guys today are much worse than what the kids were in my day. And it's not always true. Sometimes that's a pretty big exaggeration. The wartime propaganda had stressed 100% Americanism. Really, they were kind of against the Germans. Remember, they called Germans Huns. And so we kind of went to this period of nativism in the United States where it didn't really like the idea of immigration. And that's going to lead to what's called xenophobia, being afraid of immigrants. And there's so much high inflation and job competition that really going to not like the idea of immigrants coming into the United States and taking jobs. If you remember back to the Sedition Act, where you couldn't even say anything illegal or you couldn't say anything negative against the government, and striking was seen as anti-war. And so unions, again, anytime they go on strike, it's always seen as being like socialist or communist. And since socialism and communism were kind of taking hold in Europe, that's going to frighten a lot of middle and upper class Americans. Unions are still associated with socialism and communism back then. And there was some violence from anarchists. Anarchist bombs exploded in 8 American cities, intensifying the fear of radicals. There were a few world leaders that were assassinated by anarchists between 1900 and 1920-something. The Red Scare was America's reaction to the fear that was caused by these worker strikes and Bolshevism and bombs. Red is the color for communism. And so they go on like a witch hunt, basically, trying to weed out all communists. And A. Mitchell Palmer, who was the U.S. Attorney General at the time, took advantage of this fear. He was looking to gain public support, and so sometimes it helps when you're trying to get public support to have an enemy. And so he said that the communists were all around, and he's going to lead a series of raids that were known as the Palmer Raids, where he's going to round up a bunch of alleged communists and arrest them. They're going to deport a lot of people who are suspected to be an anarchist or communist. And eventually he's going to lose support of the public whenever some of his predictions are proved wrong about how many communists there were out there. As a result of polymer raids, hundreds of immigrants were forcibly deported to their home countries. During this time period, we don't like the idea of immigrants coming to the U.S., mainly because they're stealing jobs, but they're going to use that reason of them being political radicals to get them out of the United States, being socialist, communist, or anarchist. Another way that anti-immigrant sentiment came part of the national culture was through the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan has a rebirth in the 1920s. It's a very conservative time period in American history, which is when the Ku Klux Klan always seems to come back. The movie Birth of a Nation had intensified racism against African Americans, and the Red Scare also led to new groups being targeted besides just African Americans. In the 1920s, those targeted by the KKK were African Americans, radicals, immigrants, Catholics, Jews, bootleggers, and gamblers. They used cross burnings, public beatings, lynchings, all those things to put those groups down. The 1920s Klan was also more of a business organization. They sold memberships, and it's a national organization. It's not just in the South. We think of the Ku Klux Klan as being Southern, but in reality it had a very strong following in the Midwest as well as the South. And eventually the Klan's going to fall out of power in the 20s because there's going to be a sex scandal, and the Klan's supposed to be upholding conservative values, and then their leaders caught up in a sex scandal, and that's going to undermine their claims that they're morally superior and better than everybody else. But they did have a lot of power in the 1920s. There were a lot of people that were part of the Klan and started marching, and here's a picture of the Klan marching. Some of that anti-immigrant sentiment also led to Congress passing legislation that authorized immigration quotas. What that means is that only like a certain number of people could come from each country. And that was a big goal of the conservatives. They wanted to limit immigration, and that's what immigration quotas do. They say that you can only have so many immigrants come from certain areas of the world, and they're actually going to ban Chinese people completely through the Chinese Exclusion Act. And really it's meant to ban some of those people from Eastern and Southern Europe, people that they thought were more radical. Another cause and effect of the traditional versus modern culture is the temperance movement. It's also related to the fear of immigrants. I mean, think about a lot of those immigrants that came into the U.S. The Germans, in particular, have a reputation for being a little bit bigger drinkers. And so for a while, they'd advocated prohibition in order to preserve American culture. And they finally get it to be successful on a national scale because of the anti-German sentiments and grain shortages during World War I, which is why they were able to pass prohibition to begin with. So the 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcohol. It didn't necessarily ban its consumption. Compliance with prohibition was also often a matter of class, ethnic background, and religious affiliation. And you probably know that to be true in your own lives, that there are certain families that are probably more open to drinking. There are probably some families that aren't as open to drinking, depending on their class, their ethnic background, their religious affiliation. The problem with prohibition at this time was there was a huge demand for alcohol. And so since there's a lot of people that want it and it's illegal to make it and sell it, then there pops up illegal sources for buying it, like speakeasies, which proliferate through the cities. And then you also have bootleggers. The problem is there was not enough money put towards enforcing prohibition. Federal, state governments, they really couldn't stop the illegal trade or the organized crime that grew as a result of the bootlegging business. And so what's going to eventually happen is the 18th Amendment is going to be repealed, and it's going to be repealed by the 21st Amendment, because really prohibition had no chance of success, especially the fact they really just couldn't enforce it. They couldn't stop people from selling alcohol. In fact, that's actually how NASCAR got started, was because people were creating moonshine. And I mean, this is later, but still has kind of to do with the same thing. People were creating moonshine, and then they were using these fast cars to deliver it. The conflict between traditional religious beliefs and science also caused a lot of anxiety in the 1920s. This mostly has to do with the teaching of evolution. Darwin's theory of evolution starts a lot of controversy in the United States, and there had been a religious revival at the beginning of the 20th century, which is called fundamentalism, which was a belief in the literal truth of the Bible. What that means is that if the Bible says that the earth was created in 7 days, then that's exactly what it means, that it was created in 7 exactly human days. By the 1920s, 20 states had said that you could not teach evolution in school. there was a teacher by the name of John Scopes of Tennessee, and he he did this on purpose. He knew he was going to get caught. He knew he was going to get put on trial for this, but he did it so it would advance the conversation. And so he teaches evolution in school. He gets put on trial, which was called the Scopes trial, or also called the monkey trial. He was a biology teacher, and the ACLU actually gave him a lawyer and defended him. His lawyer was a guy by the name of Charles Darrow. He was prosecuted by Williams Jennings Bryan. He was a guy that ran for president as a populist back in 1896. So both were very famous at the time. This was a huge trial. It's a huge circus. What ends up happening is that Scopes loses the trial because it was illegal to teach evolution in Tennessee. He ends up being fined. But really what happens is both sides claim victory, saying they'd won the argument. And it is going to continue to be a big debate. I mean, it's even a debate today whether we should be able to teach evolution in school. But what happens is this starts the conversation, and it shows that conflict between traditional ideas, meaning like fundamentalism in religion and Christianity, versus new ideas like evolution. And so that's going to cause debate even up to this day, like I said. That concludes the standard 6.2 notes. Please turn in the video notes guide and take the quiz. Thank you.